The air was thick with the smell of burned metal and iodine. Near a shattered French village in June 1944, a makeshift tent stood against the chaos. Inside, under dim lantern light, American medics worked with quiet urgency. The canvas walls trembled with the sound of artillery far away, but their focus never wavered. A young soldier, pale and motionless, lay on a stretcher. A medic held a small glass bottle filled with a clear liquid, blood plasma. Another prepared a syringe of a new, almost magical substance, penicillin. Moments earlier, that soldier had been half dead from blood loss and infection. Now, color returned to his face. Outside, captured German officers watched through the open flap, astonished. They had never seen such organized speed, nor a medicine that could stop infection so completely. To them, it felt like witnessing the future of war, one fought not only with bullets and tanks, but with science and mercy. By 1944, the world had been engulfed in conflict for over 5 years. Europe was a continent carved into lines of fire and occupation, with millions of soldiers engaged in campaigns that stretched from the icy tundras of the Eastern Front to the sun-scorched plains of Italy. The Allies had endured long years of preparation, planning, and attrition, while Axis powers had grown both confident and desperate. The war had become a test not only of military might, but of industrial capacity, logistics, and human endurance. In the summer months, attention turned toward the liberation of Western Europe, an operation that would demand unprecedented coordination across land, sea, and air. Medical care during these campaigns was a stark contrast between nations. German field hospitals, though disciplined and meticulously structured, often relied on traditional treatments and limited supplies. They had skilled surgeons and experienced medics, but their capacity to stabilize soldiers in the chaos of modern mechanized warfare was constrained. Wounded men frequently faced long journeys before receiving proper treatment, and infections claimed thousands of lives that might have been saved with more advanced methods. In contrast, the American military had invested heavily in improving survival rates on the battlefield. Blood plasma had emerged as a revolutionary solution, allowing medics to replace lost blood in the field without waiting for a full transfusion. Penicillin, still relatively new, was administered to halt infections that had previously been fatal. Combined with mobile surgical units and streamlined evacuation protocols, these innovations were turning the tide for thousands of soldiers. Commanders noted that soldiers who would once have perished in the first hours after injury now had a fighting chance, returning to the front lines or recovering fully. The planning behind these advancements was meticulous. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had studied previous wars, noting how delayed treatment and poor sanitation had increased mortality. Their approach was systematic. Trains and trucks transported supplies to forward positions, while field hospitals were designed to operate close to the front. Nurses, often young women drawn from across the country, worked alongside doctors under fire, performing surgeries in tents, barns, or bombed-out buildings. Each hospital was stocked with not only medicines, but detailed protocols for rapid triage. Soldiers were categorized by the severity of their injuries, and those most likely to survive were treated first, a harsh but necessary reality of modern warfare. In addition to technology, training played a critical role. Medics underwent rigorous preparation, learning how to stabilize multiple casualties simultaneously, administer plasma, and recognize early signs of infection. They drilled constantly, simulating battlefield conditions to ensure that panic and chaos would not disrupt care. Their presence transformed the experience of the wounded soldier. Even amid shellfire, explosions, and the cries of comrades, American field hospitals functioned with the precision of a machine. The human element was just as important. Soldiers were reassured that help would come swiftly, that survival was no longer a matter of luck. This knowledge affected morale. Units reported that troops fought harder, knowing that their chances of recovery were higher than ever before. Letters from the front frequently mentioned admiration not only for the bravery of medics, but for the life-saving power of blood plasma and penicillin. Such measures represented more than medicine. They were a tangible promise that the military cared for the lives of its men. a stark contrast to the perceptions held by enemy officers. By the time the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, these innovations were battle-tested. Training exercises across England, simulations in the French countryside, and small-scale deployments had proven that medical efficiency could directly influence combat effectiveness. The ability to treat wounds quickly, reduce infection, and return soldiers to duty was no longer ancillary. It was central to operational planning. Even German observers began to notice reports of soldiers surviving injuries that would have been fatal in previous conflicts. The stage was set for a confrontation in which not only tanks, artillery, and infantry would determine outcomes, but the hidden battlefields of science and human resilience. This context, a world in which advanced medical practices were quietly redefining the rules of survival, led directly to the shock experienced by German officers when they finally witnessed these innovations firsthand. The moment they saw plasma and penicillin in action, they realized that the nature of war had shifted, and that the battlefield itself had become a laboratory of life and death. The development of American field medicine was not accidental. It was the result of years of preparation, research, and relentless testing. Early in the war, military doctors studied past conflicts, the Civil War, World War I, and even smaller colonial engagements, looking for patterns in battlefield mortality. They found that most soldiers did not die from bullets or shrapnel alone, but from blood loss, infection, and delayed treatment. Recognizing this, the U.S. Army began to revolutionize medical logistics, combining science with industrial efficiency. Laboratories were mobilized to produce plasma on an unprecedented scale, while penicillin, discovered in the late 1920s but only mass-produced in the early 1940s, was quickly integrated into field protocols. By 1944, these innovations were not theoretical. They were deployed across theaters of operation, saving lives in real time. Forward surgical teams were at the heart of this system. Small, mobile units moved with the troops, setting up tents, commandeered buildings, or even converted trucks as temporary hospitals. Each unit carried ample supplies of plasma, antibiotics, and surgical instruments, and was staffed by doctors and nurses trained to operate under fire. Evacuation procedures were optimized so that critically wounded soldiers could reach these units within hours of injury, a dramatic improvement over earlier wars. Helicopters were still rare, so trucks, jeeps, and occasionally small boats were pressed into service to transport casualties. These teams often worked around the clock, performing dozens of surgeries in a single night, sometimes under artillery bombardment. Behind this efficiency lay a careful orchestration of supply lines. Factories in the United States churned out plasma bottles, penicillin vials, and surgical kits at industrial scale. Cargo ships crossed the Atlantic under convoy protection, delivering essential medicines to the shores of England, France, and later the liberated territories. Engineers designed temperature-controlled storage to ensure that plasma remained viable, while nurses and medics received specialized training in the administration of these delicate treatments. The result was a chain of care that reached from American laboratories to the front lines, a lifeline invisible to most soldiers, but critical to their survival. German forces, despite their discipline and organizational skill, lagged behind in medical modernization. Field hospitals were often overcrowded, reliant on older antiseptics, and constrained by shortages caused by Allied bombing of industrial centers. While German surgeons were highly skilled and capable of extraordinary feats under pressure, they lacked the logistical support and rapid deployment systems that the Americans had perfected. Blood transfusions were limited and complex to administer, and antibiotics were scarce. Infections that might have been trivial with penicillin became death sentences. Captured soldiers and officers were sometimes struck with disbelief when confronted by the efficiency and modernity of American hospitals, an experience that challenged their expectations of battlefield medicine. The contrast was also technological. American units employed early monitoring devices, sterilization techniques, and surgical methods that minimized trauma and infection. Even minor innovations, a specially designed tourniquet, a pre-sterilized surgical kit, or a rapid plasma infusion system, could mean the difference between life and death. Medics carried these tools into the PAMs, mud, snow, and rain of Europe, treating wounds that would have overwhelmed older medical systems. The integration of science into everyday battlefield care represented a paradigm shift. Medicine became as much a weapon as the rifles and tanks that dominated strategy meetings. Human stories underscore this transformation. Letters and diaries from medics describe soldiers returning to consciousness after hours of near death, stabilized by plasma and treated with penicillin. Some men went on to survive further combat, their lives a testament to the quiet power of innovation. In interviews after the war, German prisoners repeatedly expressed astonishment at what they saw. They described a level of organization, speed, and effectiveness that they had never imagined possible. To them, these hospitals seemed almost surreal, machines of life functioning amidst the machinery of death. By the time Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the system was fully operational. Medics and surgeons were ready to act with precision, delivering care immediately to those wounded in the chaos of landing crafts and artillery fire. Every soldier knew that if they were hit, their chance of survival was higher than in any previous war, a factor that subtly changed behavior on the battlefield. Morale, strategy, and even the tempo of operations were influenced by the presence of these medical innovations. This foundation, built on meticulous planning, advanced science, and human dedication, set the stage for the moment when German officers, observing firsthand, could hardly believe what they saw. It was here, in these tents and hastily erected hospitals, that the future of warfare and of battlefield survival was unmistakably revealed. The human angle was immediate and visceral. Soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, found themselves facing injuries that would have been fatal in earlier conflicts. Shrapnel tore through flesh, bullets shattered bones, and yet, for the first time in modern war, there was hope beyond mere survival. Medics, trained to act swiftly, carried blood plasma and penicillin directly to the front lines, often exposing themselves to enemy fire to reach the wounded. One young private, shot in the leg during a reconnaissance patrol, later recalled that he remembered the sting of the needle, then a profound warmth as color returned to his face. He lived. Many others did not, but the ratio had dramatically shifted. Mortality rates plummeted, and with them came a quiet transformation in morale. Soldiers fought knowing that even the gravest wounds might be treated, that death was no longer the inevitable companion of a bullet or shell. In letters home, they described awe not only at the battlefield, but at the medics' calm under fire, their dedication, and the miraculous medicines that saved lives with astonishing speed. The human experience on these fields was forever altered by the convergence of courage and science. From a leadership angle, commanders began to see the strategic advantage of American medical innovations. Generals and colonels, accustomed to calculating losses as a grim inevitability, were now planning operations with new confidence. Units could be rotated more aggressively, knowing that soldiers could survive wounds that previously would have removed them permanently from combat. Decisions once influenced solely by manpower limitations now accounted for medical support as a force multiplier. Higher survival rates meant that experienced troops, familiar with terrain, tactics, and unit cohesion, could return to duty faster. This continuity was invaluable, particularly in protracted campaigns like Normandy and the subsequent push through France and into Germany. Leaders could rely on the predictability of recovery times, the efficiency of evacuation, and the robustness of hospital units. Orders were issued with an implicit trust in the life-saving systems in place, transforming both the conduct of battles and the confidence of those in command. The technological angle was equally striking. Blood plasma, first developed in the 1930s, but refined and mass-produced for the war, allowed medics to replace lost blood without the need for exact matches or full transfusions. Penicillin, still a relatively new discovery, became the first widely available antibiotic used in the field, revolutionizing treatment of infections. Both technologies demanded precision. Plasma needed careful storage, sterile conditions, and proper infusion techniques. Penicillin required accurate dosing and timely administration to prevent sepsis. Mobile laboratories and forward surgical teams were equipped with everything necessary to deploy these technologies under unpredictable conditions. The integration of these innovations directly into combat zones represented a fusion of science and warfare never seen before, a concept that startled not only the German military, but also observers and historians who later chronicled the campaigns. The tactical angle emphasized speed and efficiency. Medics moved with calculated urgency, guided by rigorous triage protocols. Wounded soldiers were classified by severity, ensuring that the limited number of life-saving interventions reached those most likely to survive. Evacuation networks operated like clockwork, with ambulances, jeeps, and even improvised stretchers coordinating seamlessly to transfer casualties to forward hospitals. This efficiency was critical in high-intensity environments, where delays of even a few hours could mean the difference between life and death. The tactical integration of medical units allowed infantry and armor to operate more aggressively, knowing that a sophisticated support system existed behind them. It was a subtle but profound shift. Medical care was no longer passive, reactive, or secondary. It had become a driving force that influenced decisions at every level of engagement. From the enemy perspective, these advances were almost incomprehensible. German officers, trained in traditional military doctrine, expected chaos and high mortality among the wounded. When they observed American field hospitals, they were stunned. Reports from captured officers described disbelief at the speed, cleanliness, and effectiveness of care. They could not understand how soldiers who should have bled out or succumbed to infection were being revived, stabilized, and returned to combat. Some speculated that the Americans possessed an almost unnatural capacity for survival, attributing it to superior organization, innovative technology, or even luck. These observations were not mere propaganda. They were sincere astonishment at a system that challenged conventional assumptions about the human cost of modern warfare. Morally, the presence of plasma and penicillin created a quiet revolution in the ethics of combat care. Soldiers were no longer passive victims of circumstance. The value of human life became tangible in a way previously unseen. The battlefield was still brutal, but a wounded man now had a real chance to live. Medics and nurses understood the moral weight of their work. Every intervention, every syringe, every administered dose carried profound responsibility. Letters from nurses reveal a mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment, pride in the lives saved, and solemn acknowledgement of those who could not be rescued. This moral dimension extended beyond individual soldiers to entire units, influencing cohesion, discipline, and determination. The war remained deadly, but it had become less arbitrary, less governed by chance, and more shaped by deliberate, calculated care. These angles, human, leadership, technological, tactical, enemy, and moral, intersected on Eva, Rye battlefield. They transformed ordinary survival into a structured system of preservation, altering both the immediate experience of war and the broader strategies employed by commanders. For German officers witnessing these operations, it was nothing short of revelation. They were forced to reconcile traditional ideas of battlefield inevitability with a new reality in which life could be preserved systematically, predictably, and effectively. The stage was set for moments in which these innovations would decisively shape outcomes, changing the course of battles, campaigns, and lives in ways that no one could have anticipated. The technological edge of American field medicine extended beyond plasma and penicillin. Small innovations accumulated into a system that seemed almost miraculous to those unacquainted with it. Portable sterilization units ensured that surgical instruments could be safely reused under the harshest conditions. Pre-packaged surgical kits reduced preparation time, allowing medics to operate efficiently amid gunfire, mud, and rain. Even simple items, such as specialized tourniquets and clamps, were optimized for speed and effectiveness. Each tool was a product of meticulous testing, designed to fit into the larger machinery of survival. The cumulative effect of these technologies was not merely convenience, it was survival, delivered consistently and reliably to hundreds of soldiers each day. German observers, encountering these systems firsthand, were often left speechless. They had trained for combat expecting high casualty rates, And yet here was an enemy whose wounded were being resurrected with methodical precision, a feat that seemed to defy the brutal logic of war. From a tactical standpoint, the integration of advanced medical care altered the flow of combat. Infantry units pressed forward more aggressively, reassured that wounded comrades could be evacuated quickly and treated efficiently. Artillery and armor officers coordinated movements with the knowledge that the medical network would stabilize casualties before infections took hold. Even small unit leaders understood the importance of rapid communication with field hospitals. Radio operators relayed casualty reports, allowing surgical teams to prepare for incoming patients with the appropriate supplies. This synchronization transformed what had once been chaotic and unpredictable into a controlled, responsive operation. Soldiers could fight harder, maneuver faster, and sustain pressure on enemy positions, confident that their lives were not disposable. Leadership perspectives were profoundly affected by these developments. Commanders who had spent years accepting attrition as an unavoidable cost were now confronted with a new reality. Survival could be engineered. Planning for engagements now included detailed consideration of medical support. Officers mapped out casualty evacuation routes alongside supply lines, calculated survival probabilities for wounded soldiers, and even adjusted operational tempo to maximize the efficiency of hospital units. The presence of plasma and penicillin allowed leaders to take calculated risks, knowing that the worst injuries could be mitigated. This advantage was both psychological and strategic. German commanders, witnessing the resulting resilience of American troops, were forced to reconsider their own assumptions about attrition, recovery, and morale. The battlefield was no longer just a measure of strength and firepower. It had become a test of the ability to preserve human life under extreme conditions. The enemy angle cannot be understated. German soldiers and officers frequently documented their astonishment in letters and post-war testimonies. Some described being captured and treated by American medics, expecting neglect or minimal care, only to find themselves stabilized, fed, and administered penicillin to prevent infection. Others observed battlefield hospitals from a distance, unable to comprehend how the wounded could be revived so efficiently. This was not propaganda. It was genuine disbelief. Traditional German doctrine emphasized sacrifice and acceptance of losses as inherent to combat, while American innovations appeared to challenge the natural order of warfare. Observers noted the speed of triage, the disciplined calm of medics, and the surprising survival of men who, under any other army, would have perished. These reactions underscore how medicine itself became a tactical and psychological weapon, subtly undermining enemy expectations. The human dimension extended beyond the soldiers themselves to include the medics and nurses, whose emotional labor was immense. These individuals operated under extreme stress, often for hours without rest, yet maintained a level of composure and precision that was essential to success. Many described the quiet satisfaction of seeing a soldier regain consciousness after near death, or of preventing infection that would otherwise claim life. Their courage was amplified by their training, but also by a profound moral understanding of their role. Every decision, every dose of plasma or penicillin carried the weight of life and death. This awareness shaped the culture of American field hospitals, fostering a deep sense of duty, discipline, and pride. The contrast with enemy expectations, where such intensive care was often impossible, further highlighted the advantage these teams provided. Morally, these innovations reshaped the understanding of duty in warfare. Where soldiers had once been resigned to the inevitability of death, now survival could be engineered through knowledge, planning, and precision. Ethical responsibility became tangible. Each medic's action directly saved a life, and the tools of medicine became instruments of preservation as well as instruments of war. This shift had a subtle but profound impact on the broader conduct of the conflict. Units developed greater cohesion, morale improved, and soldiers internalized the idea that they were valued beyond their utility as combatants. The presence of effective medical care bridged the gap between duty and humanity, creating an environment where war's brutality was mitigated by deliberate, organized care. Even culturally, the reactions were telling. German officers who witnessed the American field hospitals spoke of disbelief and sometimes resentment, acknowledging that these practices gave the Allies a clear advantage. Some speculated that survival rates alone were tipping the balance of engagements, noting that American troops returned to the front faster, often with minimal long-term disability. Reports circulated that emphasized the miraculous nature of these interventions. This perception, whether exaggerated or not, illustrates the broader strategic impact. Battlefield medicine had evolved into a force multiplier, a subtle but decisive factor that altered enemy calculations and expectations. Taken together, these angles demonstrate a singular truth. Battlefield medicine had become a decisive element in modern warfare. The human, technological, tactical, leadership, and moral dimensions intertwined to create a system that not only saved lives, but actively shaped the course of battles. German officers witnessing these advancements were confronted with a reality that challenged their traditional assumptions. The efficiency, speed, and precision of American field hospitals were no longer ancillary. They were central to the conduct of operations. The stage was now set for moments in which these medical innovations would not only save individual soldiers, but also influence the outcomes of entire campaigns, changing the perception of war itself. On June 6, 1944, the first wave of Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy. For many, it was a descent into chaos. Artillery fire, machine guns, and mines tore the sand and air apart. Yet behind the front lines, American field hospitals were already in motion, a network of precision and preparation that few had anticipated. Medics moved swiftly among the casualties, administering plasma and penicillin with practiced efficiency. Soldiers who moments before had lain pale and still on the sand now felt the rush of circulation and the hope of survival. Within the first hours, hundreds were stabilized, triaged, and prepared for transport to mobile surgical units further inland. Near Omaha Beach, a German officer crouched behind a sand dune, binoculars trained on a cluster of white canvas tents set up just beyond the tree line. He watched as medics worked with unrelenting focus, moving between wounded soldiers with a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. The officer could not believe what he saw. Men who should have succumbed to blood loss were alert, responsive, and in some cases joking quietly with the staff. This was not a trick or propaganda. It was science in action, manifest on the battlefield itself. His notes later described astonishment, even fear, at the efficiency and speed of care. He remarked on the presence of plasma bottles, syringes of penicillin, and the systematic triage that allowed even the gravely wounded to survive. In the following hours, a young lieutenant, struck by shrapnel in his abdomen, was rushed to a forward surgical unit. Surgeons worked tirelessly, administering plasma to replace the lost blood and injecting penicillin to prevent infection. He later recounted the experience as surreal. The pain was immense, yet he could feel life returning with each precise intervention. Nearby, nurses monitored vital signs, applied dressings, and offered reassurance to men on the brink. Every movement, every decision, was calibrated to preserve life. And within hours, the lieutenant was stable enough to be evacuated further inland. His survival was emblematic of a new era of battlefield medicine, one in which the difference between life and death could be measured in hours and inches rather than days or weeks. Elsewhere, medics treated soldiers with compound fractures and gunshot wounds that would have been fatal just years earlier. Plasma transfusions were administered in tents surrounded by chaos, artillery shaking the ground, yet the teams remained calm, efficient, and relentless. Penicillin injections prevented infections that had once claimed thousands, turning the tide of mortality in the smallest, most immediate units. In one report, a field hospital processed over 60 casualties within the first 12 hours of landings, and remarkably, only a handful succumbed. The combination of speed, technology, and human skill created results that seemed impossible, even to those trained to expect high attrition. The German perspective provides further clarity on the impact. Officers documented their disbelief in personal journals and debriefings. One senior officer wrote that the American hospitals functioned like machines of life, with men returning from the brink with a vitality that was almost unnatural. He noted that these practices were not isolated anomalies, but consistent patterns, observed across multiple sectors of the front. The cumulative effect was demoralizing. Soldiers who had anticipated easy attrition were finding the enemy stronger and more resilient than expected, bolstered not just by training, but by survival itself. The efficiency of medical care became a psychological weapon, silently shaping the battlefield in favor of the Allies. By midday, the combined effect of triage, plasma, and penicillin had shifted the dynamics of the landing. Units that might have faltered due to wounded soldiers being lost to infection now maintained cohesion. Experienced troops, previously considered at risk for attrition, remained in the fight. Tactical decisions could be made with the knowledge that the wounded had a high chance of survival and could be returned to duty. For American commanders, this was both a validation and a revelation. The battlefield was no longer a simple contest of firepower. It had become a calculated environment in which human life could be preserved and deployed strategically. The human stories underscore the profound impact. A sergeant, critically injured during the Omaha push, was treated with plasma to stabilize blood pressure, while penicillin prevented what could have been a fatal infection. He survived, recovered fully, and returned to his unit within weeks. Across Normandy, similar accounts multiplied. Soldiers who would have been permanently incapacitated or dead were now being returned to combat. The repeated success of these interventions created a cumulative advantage, tipping the balance in critical engagements. Every medic, nurse, and doctor became an unseen force multiplier, their work directly affecting the outcome of battles in ways that were invisible to the average soldier or enemy officer. Even as German forces mounted counterattacks, the American medical system absorbed the casualties with unprecedented efficiency. Injured soldiers were stabilized and returned, and units remained operational under pressure. Officers who expected to see weakened, demoralized enemies were confronted instead with resilient, reinforced troops. The shock among German observers was profound. Battlefield medicine had emerged as a decisive factor, turning the expected rules of attrition on their head. Reports from the front emphasized that the survival rates and rapid treatment capabilities were unlike anything previously encountered, a revelation that would influence both tactical decisions and long-term planning. As night fell over Normandy, the first day of the invasion closed with thousands of lives saved by the seamless integration of plasma, penicillin, and human skill. Soldiers rested, stabilized, and ready for the battles ahead, while medics and nurses continued to work tirelessly. For the Germans, the reality of what they had witnessed, an enemy capable of preserving life amid the chaos of war, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The decisive role of advanced medical care had been revealed, and the battlefield would never be the same again. The stage was now set for the continued unfolding of these innovations across Europe, shaping the war in ways both subtle and dramatic. The following days of the Normandy campaign confirmed the transformative power of American field medicine. Forward surgical units moved steadily inland, following the shifting front lines. Casualties mounted, yet survival rates remained remarkably high. Medics administered plasma to replenish lost blood and penicillin to halt infections, all while artillery shells pounded nearby. Soldiers who might have died in previous conflicts were stabilized and prepared for further combat. The efficiency of these operations became increasingly apparent to both American commanders and observing German officers, who documented their astonishment with growing urgency. They noted that men who had suffered grievous injuries were returning to duty far faster than anyone had imagined possible, challenging assumptions about the inevitability of attrition in modern warfare. Near Carentan, a young corporal suffered severe abdominal wounds during a firefight with entrenched German positions. Within minutes, he was evacuated to a mobile surgical unit. Surgeons worked with precision, administering plasma to restore blood volume and injecting penicillin to combat potential infections. Nurses monitored his vital signs tirelessly, adjusting treatments as necessary. Hours later, the corporal opened his eyes, weak but conscious, his survival almost miraculous. Stories like his multiplied across the beaches, fields, and towns of Normandy. Each life saved was a testament to the careful orchestration of medical innovation, planning, and human dedication. German officers were increasingly frustrated and disoriented by these developments. One senior officer, observing from a distance, recorded in his journal that the Americans appeared almost impervious to the typical attrition of battle. Wounded soldiers who should have been removed from action returned with astonishing speed. The psychological impact on both sides was undeniable. American troops, reassured by their access to effective care, fought with greater resolve, while German forces began to confront a new reality in which losses did not weaken their enemy in the expected manner. Traditional tactics, based on assumptions of inevitable casualty rates, were suddenly insufficient. At the tactical level, the integration of medical care influenced battlefield decisions. Commanders planned assaults and rotations with the knowledge that injured soldiers could survive severe wounds. Evacuation routes, medical staging areas, and surgical units became as crucial to operational success as artillery positions or supply lines. The ability to sustain fighting strength despite heavy casualties allowed American units to maintain offensive pressure, even in the face of determined German resistance. Medics, nurses, and surgeons became silent but decisive participants in every engagement, their actions directly shaping outcomes without ever firing a weapon. The psychological impact on German soldiers was acute. They encountered troops who had survived gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and burns, often appearing almost unscathed. Reports describe officers struggling to comprehend these survival rates, attributing them to extraordinary skill, meticulous planning, or even luck. Letters from captured soldiers expressed disbelief at the calm efficiency of American field hospitals. Medics moved among the wounded with focus and precision, plasma bags in hand, penicillin syringes ready, and surgical teams prepared for every contingency. The result was a force multiplier that undermined enemy morale while reinforcing Allied confidence. In one particular engagement near St. Lo, the decisive role of field medicine became undeniable. An infantry company, pinned down by German machine guns, suffered numerous casualties. The wounded were evacuated to a nearby forward surgical unit, where plasma transfusions restored stability and penicillin injections prevented infections that would have otherwise been fatal. Within days, many of these soldiers returned to duty, reinforcing their company at a critical moment. Commanders noted the extraordinary impact of this medical resilience, acknowledging that the ability to preserve life had directly contributed to the success of the operation. German officers, observing from afar, could only marvel at the scale and consistency of the interventions. The human stories that emerged were equally compelling. Soldiers who had faced imminent death recounted their experiences with awe and gratitude. Nurses described long hours filled with urgency, exhaustion, and determination, yet tempered by a profound sense of purpose. Each intervention, each dose of plasma or penicillin, carried immense moral and emotional weight. The combination of advanced medicine, human skill, and precise coordination created a battlefield reality where life could be preserved amidst death, where hope could exist in the heart of chaos. By mid-July 1944, the impact of American field hospitals was clear across the Normandy front. Casualty survival rates had increased dramatically, and soldiers were returning to combat at unprecedented levels. German officers, through reports and personal observations, acknowledged the undeniable advantage. They saw a system that not only healed wounds, but maintained operational strength, bolstered morale, and altered the strategic calculus of war. The battlefield was no longer governed solely by firepower and numbers. The science of medicine had become a decisive factor. The climax of this transformation was not a single battle, but a sustained demonstration of capability across multiple engagements. Normandy had become a proving ground where the integration of plasma, penicillin, and meticulous medical planning revealed a new dimension of warfare. Soldiers who would have been casualties in any previous conflict now survived, healed, and returned to fight. Medics and surgeons, moving under fire, had rewritten the rules of survival. German officers, witnessing this unprecedented efficiency and resilience, confronted a profound shock. The battlefield itself had changed, and with it, the expectations of life, death, and victory. As the Allies pushed inland, the combined effects of courage, science, and organization became increasingly evident. Survival rates soared, units remained cohesive despite heavy fire, and strategic operations proceeded with confidence rooted in the ability to preserve human life. The medical innovations first deployed in the chaos of the beaches had proven their worth under the harshest conditions, altering the course of campaigns and leaving a lasting impression on all who observed them. The stage was now set to examine the consequences of this transformation, both immediate and long-term, as the war continued to unfold. The Normandy campaign had ended, but the consequences of advanced American field medicine were only beginning to be understood. Reports circulated detailing the unprecedented survival rates of soldiers who had previously been considered lost. Field hospitals had become a lifeline, ensuring that injuries which would have been fatal in past wars were now survivable. Blood plasma transfusions and penicillin treatments had reduced mortality from infections and hemorrhage dramatically. Official U.S. Army statistics from the period reflect a drop in death rates among wounded soldiers from nearly 30% in earlier conflicts to less than 10% in the summer of 1944. These numbers were extraordinary, not only for their immediate impact on the battlefield, but for their demonstration of the potential of modern medicine to influence the outcome of war. Commanders at all levels began to adjust their strategies in response to these realities. Units could fight longer, rotate more aggressively, and sustain offensive pressure knowing that medical support would stabilize the wounded. Experienced soldiers, who might have been permanently removed from combat due to injuries, returned to their units, preserving leadership, skill, and cohesion. This continuity allowed for sustained operations, contributing directly to the success of the Normandy breakout and subsequent advances through France. Even minor engagements were now influenced by the presence of capable medical teams, as medics and nurses ensured that the fighting strength of each unit was preserved. German officers, having observed these operations firsthand, were both astonished and demoralized. Captured reports and post-war testimonies describe disbelief at the organization and efficiency of American field hospitals. Soldiers who should have succumbed to blood loss or infection were revived and returned to action. Ayres noted that this had a profound psychological effect. American troops fought with confidence, reassured that even the gravest injuries were not necessarily fatal. In contrast, German troops often faced higher mortality and longer recovery times, putting them at a disadvantage in both morale and operational capacity. The disparity highlighted the growing importance of medical innovation as a strategic factor in modern warfare. The human dimension of the aftermath cannot be overstated. Thousands of soldiers, once on the brink of death, were restored to health and returned to civilian life or continued combat duty. Veterans recounted stories of being saved by plasma or penicillin, often crediting the calm efficiency and dedication of medics and nurses with their survival. Families received letters from soldiers who had been gravely wounded, yet were recovering in field hospitals, a testament to the profound impact of these medical advances. The emotional resonance extended beyond the battlefield, shaping the collective understanding of the war's human cost and the value of life amidst conflict. Medical personnel themselves faced lasting consequences. Nurses and medics carried the weight of high-stress environments, treating soldiers under fire and witnessing both miraculous recoveries and tragic losses. Yet, their work established standards that would persist long after the war. Techniques developed in the chaos of Normandy influenced post-war medical practice, from surgical procedures to triage protocols. The legacy of these innovations extended beyond military operations, informing civilian medicine and demonstrating the potential for rapid, organized medical responses in emergency situations. Strategically, the success of American field hospitals influenced Allied planning for the rest of the European campaign. Operations now incorporated detailed medical support as a core component rather than an ancillary function. Mobile surgical units followed armored, treatment, and the tangible sense of hope that accompanied survival, creating a bond of trust and respect between frontline troops and the medical corps. Statistical evidence reinforced these narratives. Mortality among severely wounded soldiers dropped dramatically, and the proportion of troops returning to duty increased substantially. Casualty evacuation times were reduced, and hospitals closer to the front ensured that critical interventions were administered promptly. Field reports from multiple campaigns confirmed that plasma transfusions had stabilized thousands of soldiers, and penicillin had prevented infections that would otherwise have been fatal. These innovations, combined with rigorous training and planning, created a system in which the outcome of injuries was no longer left to chance. The strategic consequences extended beyond individual survival. Military planners recognized that the ability to preserve soldiers affected operational tempo, decision-making, and long-term campaign planning. Commanders could commit units more aggressively, confident that the wounded would be cared for efficiently. Offensive operations maintained momentum, and experienced troops could continue to participate in successive engagements. In effect, medical innovation became a force multiplier, preserving both lives and combat capability. German forces, facing an enemy whose wounded continued to fight, were forced to adapt or risk being outmaneuvered and outlasted. Moreover, the psychological effect on American troops was significant. Knowing that plasma and penicillin were available instilled confidence and reduced fear among soldiers confronting life-threatening injuries. Morale improved, cohesion strengthened, and units operated with a renewed sense of purpose. This intangible advantage proved crucial in sustained operations, as soldiers were more willing to take calculated risks, knowing that the likelihood of survival was higher than in any previous conflict. The battlefield itself had evolved into an environment where hope and human ingenuity could directly influence outcomes. By late 1944, the reputation of American field hospitals had reached German high command. Officers acknowledged that the consistent survival of wounded troops provided the Allies with both tactical and strategic benefits. The ability to sustain combat strength while minimizing permanent losses represented a profound evolution in warfare. These hospitals were not merely facilities for care, they were instruments of military power, shaping the course of campaigns and the expectations of both sides. The aftermath of Normandy and the subsequent campaigns demonstrated that battlefield medicine could no longer be considered secondary. Survival rates, operational effectiveness, and morale were all intertwined with the presence of skilled medics, advanced treatments, and rapid evacuation. German officers, facing the reality of these innovations, were compelled to reconsider conventional doctrines of attrition and casualty management. The war had revealed a critical truth. The ability to preserve life could be as decisive as any weapon, altering not only individual fates but the very course of history. Columns, evacuation routes were mapped with precision, and supply lines ensured a steady flow of plasma, penicillin, and surgical equipment. The integration of medicine into operational planning became a defining characteristic of Allied campaigns, illustrating that the preservation of human life was both a moral imperative and a practical necessity. German military assessments, circulated in reports after the war, confirmed the magnitude of the advantage. Officers acknowledged that the disparity in medical care had tangible effects on the battlefield. Units that faced heavy engagement suffered fewer permanent casualties, maintaining combat effectiveness in ways that the Germans could not match. This recognition reinforced the idea that medical innovation was no longer a support function, but a decisive factor in modern warfare. The contrast between American and German medical capabilities underscored the evolution of war. Victory was no longer determined solely by firepower and tactics, but by the ability to preserve and restore life under fire. The impact of these developments rippled far beyond Normandy. As Allied forces advanced through France, Belgium, and Germany, the same principles of rapid medical intervention continued to save thousands of lives. Forward surgical units became mobile lifelines. Plasma transfusion stabilized the gravely wounded, and penicillin prevented infections that had once claimed so many. Each success reinforced the strategic advantage, cementing the perception among both Allies and Axis forces that modern medicine was an integral weapon of war. Soldiers, commanders, and observers alike came to understand that the future of combat had shifted. Survival could be engineered, and the battlefield was no longer ruled solely by death and destruction. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the cumulative effects of advanced medical care became increasingly apparent. Casualty rates, once a predictable measure of attrition, no longer reflected the reality of combat. Units sustained their strength far longer than expected, often returning soldiers to the front lines within days or weeks, rather than months. Forward surgical teams, mobile hospitals, and well-trained medics became essential components of operational planning, their presence as crucial as artillery and ammunition. The combination of plasma transfusions, penicillin, and precise triage protocols had transformed the battlefield into a controlled environment where life could be preserved even under extreme conditions. German officers continued to express astonishment and, at times, frustration. Personal accounts described their disbelief at the speed with which wounded American soldiers recovered. Officers noted that men who should have been permanently incapacitated were returning to fight with minimal delay, often maintaining morale and unit cohesion. Some reported a sense of helplessness, recognizing that traditional strategies aimed at exhausting the enemy's manpower were increasingly ineffective. The disparity in medical capabilities created a subtle yet powerful psychological advantage for the Allies, reshaping both engagements and expectations of survival. The human stories from this period highlight the profound emotional and moral impact of these medical innovations. Soldiers who had been critically injured found themselves stabilized by plasma and saved from infections by penicillin. Medics and nurses, operating in chaotic conditions, maintained their composure and precision, performing surgeries and administering treatments that determined the difference between life and death. Soldiers recounted waking from near-death experiences, often with profound gratitude for the skill and dedication of the medical teams. Letters sent home describe awe at the efficiency of the story of American field hospitals in World War II is more than a tale of medicine. It is a testament to human ingenuity, organization, and compassion in the midst of unimaginable destruction. Blood plasma and penicillin transformed the battlefield, turning injuries that once meant certain death into opportunities for survival and recovery. Soldiers who would have been lost to hemorrhage or infection were restored to life, returning not only to their units, but to their families, their communities, and the broader course of history. This shift redefined what was possible in war. Survival was no longer left to chance, but could be engineered through planning, technology, and human dedication. German officers, observing these innovations, were confronted with a reality that challenged their assumptions about warfare. They had expected attrition, chaos, and inevitable loss, yet the Americans had created a system that preserved life with astonishing efficiency. The shock they felt was profound, illustrating how medical advancements could become a decisive factor, influencing morale, strategy, and operational outcomes. For the Allies, the integration of science and care into the theater of war became both a practical advantage and a moral statement. Even amid destruction, human life could be safeguarded and valued. Beyond the immediate impact on the battlefield, the legacy of these innovations endured. Techniques developed under fire influenced post-war medicine, from emergency response to surgical protocols, leaving a lasting imprint on both military and civilian healthcare. The war demonstrated that human ingenuity, when combined with courage and compassion, could bend the harshest circumstances toward preservation rather than destruction. Ultimately, the story of plasma, penicillin, and the dedicated men and women who administered them reminds us that warfare is not defined solely by firepower or strategy. It is also shaped by the ability to protect, heal, and restore. In a world dominated by conflict, these field hospitals became symbols of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of human life, even in the heart of war. The lessons learned in those tents, under artillery fire and chaos, continue to resonate. Science and humanity together can alter the course of history, one life at a time.